Started with our webinar on how to best prepare for an upgrade to SharePoint 2013. If you guys have any questions, we'll probably leave most of the questions for the end, but feel free to type them away as they go through so you don't forget them when we're covering certain topics. This will also be recorded as well, so you can grab a recording and review some of the material if you need to. Okay, so when we talk about upgrades to SharePoint with any version, we really talk around the same kind of steps that has to happen. Very important to understand that it's not just a big bang, let's just go do a once-off migration or upgrade and we're done. It really is a cycle of events that you need to prepare for. And typically we divide it into these different phases. So the first one's learn, working out all the different ways that you can do things, what are the sort of methods you think you might want to use to upgrade. Then we move into prepare, getting ready to plan that strategy and document it a bit more as to how you're actually going to perform it. We go through test and implement and validate. And typically with any migration or upgrade, we like to plan for at least 2 test cycles of doing an upgrade before we do that final production migration. You can be pretty lucky with environments that don't have many customizations, and you might only need 1, but we prefer to plan for 2, and then if you don't need the second test migration, that's always a happier place to be in than plan for 1 and then need 2. So we're going to talk through each of these different stages and the important considerations, and we'll start with the content in Learn. So this is sort of just a picture I like to use so that people remember it's an upgrade cycle. Alright, so the first thing you need to know if you're moving to 2013 are what are some of the server prerequisites and also some of the client-side things to make sure that the organisation is actually ready to use it. No point doing a migration if some of the hardware and software considerations just aren't going to work for your organisation. So the first thing to understand is that you can't actually upgrade on the existing servers you have. You're going to have to provision new servers, and they will have to be provisioned with the minimum specs for SharePoint 2013. Which is actually Windows Server 2008 R2 or 2012, and you'll have to go to the same versions of SQL as well. If you did want to use your existing SharePoint 2010 farm hardware, what you would have to do is you'd have to uninstall it, clean all the installation media off and any references to SharePoint, basically rebuild the entire OS and then use it, which, as you can probably imagine, is a pretty bad idea because you've just taken out your entire production farm while you're doing it. So in general, we always talk about new hardware for 2013 migrations. Big part of the story is also the client side. You're going to have users that want to connect in and use this system, so you need to make sure that they're not going to experience any issues as well. The best versions of Office platform to be on are really the 2010 or Office 2013 versions. And then if you're doing some of the more configuration items using SharePoint Designer, you want to try to be using SharePoint Designer, the new 2013 version of that as well to match. You can use the older SharePoint Designer 2010 for some old mode sites, but really better to move to the new version. And also SharePoint Workspace will actually work with both. The other important part of the story, of course, is the browser that you're using. So Internet Explorer 8 or higher is the aim for support there. There's also great support of non-Microsoft browsers, going through the mobile browsers as well. So unless you're on a very old version of Internet Explorer, there shouldn't be too much issues there. There used to be 2 main methods for if we were talking about 2010 upgrades that are really database attach and in-place farm upgrade. Now they've actually changed that around a little bit, so the only one we can do when we're going for an older version of SharePoint to 2013 is what's called database attach upgrade. This was the method we always recommended for upgrades anyway, so it's not really a bad thing to ever remove this, because the beauty of using database attached means you can have your current SharePoint farm running and people still accessing content in a read-only mode the entire time you do the upgrade. So there's much less downtime, and you've also got a very good rollback story should any issues occur. There is still what's called an in-place farm upgrade, but that's only for what we call build-to-build upgrades, so patchings. When Service Pack 1 comes out for 2013, that will be when you would do an in-place upgrade to that new Service Pack version. With 2010 upgrades, there are only a couple of databases that you could attach and bring across, being the content databases, the profile database and the project databases. In order to get a lot more of your configuration across from 2010 though, they've actually extended this. So if you're on the 2010 version of SharePoint, you can bring across your project databases as well. What that will do is it'll merge the four you've got currently back into one to make it a lot more manageable. And then you can also do your search admin, your social database, your managed metadata, and your secure store. You can only do your secure store if you've got the passphrase there for it, but presuming you've got the configuration, that one will come across. So you'll get the majority of your configuration pieces through the database attach method. The things that won't come across, the configuration database. So there are some settings you'll miss at the server platform level, and we'll talk about how to handle those in a minute. And also you won't get your search index. So what you need to do is to plan to re-index when you're on the new platform. If you've got a really large amount of content, you can plan it in a way so that users will be able to access that content very quickly. For example, if you're indexing your file shares, you might decide to have your production 2013 farm running for a couple of weeks before you go live and get that indexing process going. So all that part of the index is already fresh and there and ready to go, and the only bit you have to re-index once you've done your upgrade to 2013 is the content that you've brought across. Also, you can't bring across your sync database for the user profile, but that really doesn't hold any useful information anyway, so it wouldn't give you a lot of value. The other really important thing from an infrastructure and technology point is that the Windows Classic support for authentication is now considered to be deprecated. So it's not really something that you want to look at using with the 2013 platform. It is actually possible to run web apps in this legacy mode if you need to, but there's significant loss of functionality with the new features that you won't be able to use. Some of the things like Office web apps won't function properly. So really what we need to do is look at getting to Windows claims. Of course, if you're already using claims, that won't be too much of an issue. And if you're using forms authentication already with non-Windows claims, you can there's no issues there in bringing that across. Now with the migration to claims, this is a fairly big change for lots of people within their network environment, and particularly if you've got a lot of third-party apps connecting in with your SharePoint environment. It's something that you really want to try to isolate from your upgrade to SharePoint 2013. If you do both together without any sort of testing or space between the two, it's really hard to work out which one of the two events is causing issues. So what we would suggest is do your main migration, perform some testing, and then do the claims flick, or the opposite way around. We've actually got a number of customers already that are looking to move their production environments across to claims now on 2010 to prepare for a smooth migration process. It's also very important that you have your authentication mode set up before you attach any of the databases, and we'll talk more about the process for doing that later. As you go through this claims migration, the biggest things to ensure you have in your testing cycle is anything that accesses external data, anything outside the SharePoint platform, even if you're accessing things like analysis services, reporting services on SQL Server, whether it's third-party systems or non-Microsoft products. So I'd definitely be listing all those things, including web services, in your test plan to go through once you do the migration to claims. There's also a number of other upgrade improvements that they've added within SharePoint 2013 that are important to know about when you're starting to think about planning your upgrade cycle. We'll talk about the first two, deferred site collection upgrade and federated services compatibility, a little bit more in the following slides. I'm just going to touch on the other four very quickly. They've actually added something in 2013 called site collection health checks. This isn't so much of a benefit for when you're doing your first upgrade, but will be really good for helping keep your platform nice and clean for as you go through the patching cycle into Service Pack 1 upgrades and those kind of things. What they've done is they've added a bunch of site collection-based health checks that you can regularly run, and they'll start reporting on any issues that might be in that site collection. Things like whether users have gone through and done a certain level of customization that might cause issues, or anything else that will flag, and that rule set is quite extensive in there. So definitely something that once you get upgraded, you want to have a look at running these site collection health checks to get a sense of how your farm is running. There's lots of notifications that occur during the upgrade process. We'll touch on a couple that are used in site collection upgrade. But it's important to run through that list and just make sure that you're aware of what notifications are going out and that those notifications are appropriate for the audience they're being sent to. It can be very confusing if it's an administrator level notification that goes out to a wide range of customers, a wide range of internal users. Or it could just says contact system administrator, for example. So you do have the chance to get in and customize a lot of these, which is definitely recommended. There's also a whole range of logging changes that will become useful. Logging traditionally went onto the file system of the servers that were running SharePoint. It still does that from a system admin. We still have that ability to look in there. But there's also a bunch of site collection level logging that's happening now. This is really useful for going in and looking at SharePoint environments that might be running in a shared mode where you can't actually easily get on the servers. If servers are being managed by someone else as well, you can use this. You can go in there and start seeing if there were any issues in the upgrade or if there are any ongoing issues occurring after the upgrade. We've also got the ability to throttle some of the upgrades that are going to happen. We'll talk a little bit about the two-step upgrade process that happens in the moment. As part of that, they've added a whole bunch of commands that allow you as an admin to really get in there and control when upgrades are actually going to happen to ensure that your servers are basically not going to get flooded by too many upgrade events. So one of the big changes they've made with 2013 is when you do your database attach, it goes through and upgrades the entire back-end schema of your SQL database to match 2013, but it doesn't actually flick any of the site collections across to use the new 2013 visuals and look and feel. They are left in what's called deferred site collection upgrade mode. And if you want to, and if you've tested this properly, you can go through using some PowerShell commands and push all your sites across. But for many customers, because there's a lot of testing that needs to happen of all these sites, and maybe some sites they want to flick across and some sites they don't, they may run in what is called this deferred site collection upgrade mode for a while. 2010 had a similar version of this. The difference is that with the visual upgrade component that was in 2010, it was very light. Things looked exactly like the older version of SharePoint, but they didn't really function the same way. So some of the customizations broke, and a lot of things were, it was very, very temporary short-term mode. With the 2013 backwards compatibility mode, again, it looks quite like the old version, so that's really good from an end-user point of view, but it also functions quite like the old version because if you actually look in the server, the majority of the 2010 artifacts are actually sitting on the file system of a 2013 install. So it's quite what we call deep backwards compatibility, in that most customizations, as long as they're done in a supported way and brought across as part of the upgrade, they're going to function just like they're functioning today. So that gives you a bunch of time if you do need to upgrade them and you do need to do some remediation work before you're ready to switch on the full SharePoint 2013 mode. A little bit of what this looks like. What you can see here is that you have the concept of 14 mode and 15 mode site pages. If a page is in 14 mode, the old mode, essentially it goes through and it still accesses the underscore layouts directory. It's hitting a whole bunch of templates in the 14 templates layout directory and those kind of things, and accessing a lot of the old controls. If the page has been switched across to 15 mode, it goes and hits a different part of the file system, layout/15, and loads all the appropriate 15 artifacts. And we'll talk about later how you can actually use some of this within your own code as well to render different user experiences if you've written customizations. As we go through that process of allowing end users or site collection admins to opt in and choose when to upgrade their site, there's a bunch of notifications that happen. So you saw the system status bar comes across, and that's like a non-customizable built-in message. You can't really change that, but it will actually notify them when their site collection's read-only, when it's upgrading, and when the upgrade's complete. But with the template-based emails, you can actually go in and customize these on a web application level. So this is where you can provide some more information on who to contact if there's issues, or whatever sort of messaging you want to push out through your organization. Now the important thing to note, if we just go back 2 slides, when we actually go in and request, when we see our, it's the next one. When we actually see our sites like this, what will actually happen is you can see that this is looking very much like SharePoint 2010. We can see it's got experience, all that 15 has to offer, start now or remind me later. So if you hit the start now, what that will actually do is it creates what is called an evaluation site collection. This is an important difference from what used to happen with 2010. Rather than flicking the existing site across to a different mode, we'll actually create a complete copy of that site collection and show that using the new visuals. So there's 2 important things there. Because it's creating an absolute copy of the site, when you're planning for this, if you're going to let site admins do this, you need to allow for at least double the space within your SQL Server, because you're going to end up with 2 copies of sites for a period of time. You also need to make sure you get the correct messaging out there, because while it gives them an evaluation site where they can test all the new features, once they then actually decide to commit that upgrade, the evaluation site is deleted and the main site is pushed across. So it's just important for them to know that anything they do in that evaluation site collection won't be persisted when they actually do the final upgrade. It's a pure testing playpen, so it will delete that piece. There are some features which are not supported while you're in that 14 mode, or are different while they are in the 14 mode. So a lot of the new 2010 features, as you can imagine, aren't permitted until you do the upgrade. What you'll find as well is that the 2010 Web Analytics, that's had a major upgrade in 2013 to a completely different architecture and really a search-driven feature instead of the old Web Analytics that was there. So that piece will be basically completely removed, and only the Web Analytics features are enabled when you're in the new 15 mode. Same with Office Web Applications. Because of the architectural change that's occurred with Office Web Applications, also the Project Web Access sites. That's another one that, while the project sites are supported in both 14 and 15, there are some features where the actual PWA template needs to be upgraded to use it. So the important things to remember is if you are doing that upgrade, you need to make sure that you've allowed the right space to do it, and you're also going to go through the user education pieces as well, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Now, for many organizations, they might not just have one SharePoint farm. Often you have multiple SharePoint farms, whether it's an internet site, an intranet, or a shared server setup. Or even they might be just quite ready to shift all their content across from 2010 to 2013, might choose to just use some of the new 2013 features and shift one of the web applications across to something similar. So they've actually added what are called federated services compatibility across the different versions to allow for some of this. What this means is there's certain services, and they're the main ones that you would often share out between farms, being search, user profile, social, secured store, managed metadata, and VCS, that you can upgrade to 2010, and then you can consume. You can actually consume the 2013. You can upgrade to 2013 and consume them from a 2010 farm. What this means as well, if you do have multiple farms, you don't have to do all of them at the same time. You can choose to do your services farm first, get all these services supported, share them back to your old farms, and then slowly upgrade those 2010 farms as and when needed. Right, so that's the major topics in Learn. So really you've got to learn those basics, make sure you've got the server, server prereqs and client prereqs that are going to cater for your upgrade. And then we can now move into preparing. This is really about working out what you've got so you can plan the right upgrade strategy to get there. The first thing you really need to do is know what you've got on your SharePoint farm. Now, lots of customers, when I talk to this about, they pull out some build document that they've got and they say, oh, this is exactly what SharePoint's like, and no one's touched it. They haven't installed any customization since then. But then as soon as you start going in and actually looking around, there often is quite a lot of changes that have happened since some of those initial documentation has occurred. So we really recommend it's worth actually getting on the server, having a look around and running some commands to make sure that you've done a full audit of what you've really got, not what you actually think you have. The sort of things you're looking for are content databases, you know, how big are they, how many have you got, do they have any issues in them, what customizations are being used, are you using any cross-farm topologies, do you have different services that are being used or which services aren't being used, and also things like your farm and web application configuration. Anything at that farm configuration level that's not in one of those service databases we can attach, these are the things that you're going to have to make sure you can pick up and manually bring across to your SharePoint environment. Things like alternative access mappings, managed paths, farm level customizations. So there are a couple of commands that can help with gathering this. One of the things you can run is called test SP content database. You can run that both on 2010 and 2013, and what that does is it runs through a content database and tells you what all the customizations are that are needed to be attached and whether or not they exist on the web application that you're looking at. If you had people poking around on your file system, you can run WinDiff, that can be helpful. And if you're on an older version, so if you wanted to upgrade off 2007, you can actually run the pre-upgrade check command, and that will give out a full report on the upgrade. But that doesn't exist in the 2010 or 2013 versions. Because we're going to build a new SharePoint farm to get across to 2013, the main activity that can be quite time-consuming is making sure you get all the customizations together, get them installed, and get them working on the new farm. So we need to look at what WSPs or solution files you've got installed. If they're sandbox solutions, they're fine. They will come across with your content databases. But typically most customizations have been deployed as full trust solutions, so you need to make sure you can grab them. Now, if you've got an environment that has a strong change control process, you'll have hopefully all the latest versions sitting in a nice installation directory you can copy across. But as most environments have been running for several years by the point we're looking at upgrade, often what we have to do is extract these from the existing environment. And there is a way to do that through grabbing a copy of the configuration database and actually pulling the solutions out of there. Obviously not on your live database, you definitely want to do that on a copy. Other things you need to look at, some third-party tools especially often are deployed rather than with the WSP. There's actually an MSI or an XE that does the installation. And if you've had any people who've been doing unsupported changes manually on the file system, you'll need to get ready to X-copy those across or to remove them. So that can be a good thing to use a directory comparison tool to make sure you have it all if anyone has fiddled around at that level. With customizations, we put them in 3 different areas, and depending on which area they're in, there's more likelihood whether or not they will work on the new 2013 environment. So these are the 3 major areas. First one is visually impacting, things like master pages, themes, web parts where people interact with user interface, pages, those kind of things. Then what we call data structure impacting, content type lists, web templates. If you use definitions, hopefully by now everyone's moved off those. And then finally what we call non-visually impacting. These are the things that run behind the scenes, web services, timer jobs, service applications, kind of things. Look through each one of these. So with visually impacting customizations, most likely these won't work well if you look across the new 15 mode user experience. The reason for that is a lot of the user interface has been rebuilt, and they've actually used some great technology around CS3 to do that and better achieve cross-browser compatibility. But it means that most of the dependencies you would have had in there around using them have changed if you've tried to adopt SharePoint's current user interface. So what that means is that you will have to actually perform an upgrade of the visuals, not necessarily the functional pieces, but how they look to make sure they fit in with the new SharePoint 2013 look and feel. Generally, this is a fairly easy thing to do, but it's important that it's done before users start trying to use some of these customizations, as otherwise they might think things are quite broken just because of a very different look and feel or missing buttons or those kind of things. Usually, though, if you're sticking in that 14 mode, these should run fine because a lot of those old JavaScript and CSS references are there. They will actually function in both the 14 mode. Important to test, though, in both modes to make sure they are ready for when you switch across to those upgraded site collections. Also, with those sort of customizations, they typically won't throw any error, an issue. You like to work out that there's a big problem. The second category, data structure impacting customizations. These are the highest likelihood to actually cause a blocking issue that will stop your upgrade from proceeding if they're missing. So really critical you get these guys across. You can actually change them during the upgrade, but this can be usually quite expensive. So we would really generally suggest if you did want to make changes to any of your data structure, you do that as a separate piece of work to actually the upgrade itself. And you may need to deal with conflicting customizations, particularly if something's been upgraded multiple times through the life of your farm. You might have some sites with an old version of a customization and some sites that actually have a newer version, so that's something to keep in mind. With the non-visually impacting customizations, these are the most common ones that I see people forget, because these are things that run behind the scenes. You know, typically it might be a service that runs once a week that does something, or you know, something that visually you don't really know what it's doing, but it's critical to some of the business functionality. But also the highest likelihood to be incompatible with SharePoint 2013. Because they're typically using parts of the APIs that have had the biggest amount of upgrading. So if you do have any pieces in there like Windows services or HTTP handlers or modules or anything like that, these are definitely something to flag. We'll likely need a recompilation, if not changing of code altogether, and potentially a lot of testing and some remediation to get them running. In some cases they can also be removed. The other biggest area that can often be a problem is third-party customizations. One of the big problems with these is that you are basically reliant on the vendor having a third-party version available before you can actually perform the upgrade. You can't really get into the code and fix it and then perform the upgrade yourself. So as you're starting to do that report and going through and working out what third-party customizations you have, it's a good time to get in touch with all the vendors and have a look as to whether or not they've got a third-party version of their tool out for 2013. Typically, most of the leading vendors already have their 2013 versions out, or at least a release date announced for when they will be launching. So for most of the big vendors, they're already covered. It's merely some of the smaller tools that they may not have had the time to actually get ready for 2013 yet. What you'll find is even if you have some of the things like you might have the MSI from 2010, because MSIs typically check the version of the operating system and SharePoint they're installing on, you won't actually be able to perform that installation using the old artifacts, even if they would function on the 2013 farm. Sometimes you may actually be able to extract some of the artifacts like WSPs and manually install them in a sort of a workaround. But once you start getting to those kind of stages where you're having to perform a lot of manual remediation steps, I recommend it's a really good time to reconsider whether or not you need that customization or that component that you're using, and see whether you can replace it either with out-of-the-box features or with a vendor that keeps things more up to date so that they've got 2013 features available. Because what you'll find is it's not only when you've done this upgrade that it's going to cause a problem, but as patches come out and as you choose to go to future versions of the product, there are always going to be issues if they're not up to date. So very good time to take stock of some of those third-party customizations, see if they're in use, see if they support the new version in a best practices way, and if they do any unsupported calls like touching the content database or they're difficult to install or upgrade, have a look at whether or not you can get rid of them and replace them with a viable alternative. And what I would recommend is, just so you don't have too much during the upgrade, if you are going to get rid of these things, ideally try to have that as a separate task. So clean up your existing farm before you do the upgrade. All right, so I mentioned the test SP content database command. This is really a good thing to start running against web applications so that you can get an idea of all the things that you need. Essentially, it will identify configuration gaps, missing customizations, and any kind of issues that you might have. So that's definitely one to have a look up on TechNet and start proactively running that command to get an idea of what you're going to have to move across. Other considerations that you want to take into account, which we'll talk through now, we'll go through disruption versus downtime, performance, URL changes, governance, and notification plan. So disruption, people often focus a lot on downtime, which is when, how long SharePoint's not going to be available. But for end users, you really want these guys to be pretty happy and you want them to love the new service. For them, disruption can actually be a bigger thing as downtime. Typically, downtime is well communicated and planned, but people forget to let the end users know about all the things that they may consider to be a big problem. It can be simple things like a fundamental change in the way they work with the product. If that hasn't been communicated, or there's a URL change they don't know about, anything like that they suddenly hit the SharePoint site and have to do something completely different, they can consider a major disruption to their work, and that can really cause a bad experience with the SharePoint environment. So it's really important to think about what you're doing and whether or not it will disrupt those users. Lots of upgrades are often led by IT, and they do tend to think more about some of the technical, how do we actually do this upgrade, rather than how is this going to impact our users. Or simple things like if there's another major change going on that's going to interrupt the user's daily work, you might want to stagger them out to make sure there's not too much change happening at once. So definitely worth engaging with the users, communicating, making sure they get a chance, the key stakeholders if you can, as part of UAT, to have a look at the changes that are going to happen and that they're across it, so that when everything flicks across to 2013, it's not a big pain for them and they know about all the disruption that may happen, and there's a plan and communication that's going to help alleviate that. The second part is downtime. And when you talk to people, it's always, yep, we want zero downtime. Which is not really possible. We can't do none, but we can do a very low amount of downtime. Typically what we can do is, with the new database attach method, essentially we'll build the whole SharePoint 2013 architecture, do some tests of upgrade, and then when we've got the final sign-off to do the production migration, often that'll happen across a weekend, and what we will do is at a certain time, we'll turn the existing SharePoint 2010 environment to read-only. It might be 5 o'clock Friday, for example, or later, depending on if you're a global business. Everything turns to read-only. Then we're able to back up that content, attach it to the SharePoint 2013 environment, and start the upgrade activities that we've planned out. Now, the whole time all those upgrade activities are happening, end users can still access things on the 2010 environment. So everything's read-only. They can still get to it. They just can't write content to it. Then what we'll do is, once the upgrade's completed and testing occurs, that's when we'll finally switch the DNS name round to the new SharePoint 2013 server, and it becomes available for end users. So essentially for them, they'll just see a quick flick across from the old version to the new version, and they can start using features. And really there's been very little downtime for them other than some read-only access to documents. As part of that process, we can also do parallel database upgrades to help improve the throughput. So if you've got a lot of content databases, as long as you can beef up some of the hardware that's running things, if you've got a good SQL server and you can get enough network throughput as well, we can actually do multiple databases at the same time through an upgrade process. And that can dramatically decrease the actual time it takes to get that upgrade completed. So what we might often do is we might even, particularly with virtual hardware, basically borrow some resources for the weekend to make sure that upgrade goes smoothly, and then dial it back down once it goes into production. The other important thing to plan for is performance. So many upgrades I see, people just build their new architecture like for what they have on the old version. Now, if what you're doing on SharePoint 2013 is going to be exactly what you're doing on SharePoint 2010, I guess that might be functional, but then, you know, the argument would be why you're actually doing the upgrade. There is a lot of architecture changes in SharePoint 2013. Things like Office Web Applications now requires different servers to be installed on. The social features rely heavily on a feature called distributed cache, and the whole workflow engine has changed as well in there. So it's important to know what kind of performance you want, what features you're going to use, and then plan your hardware accordingly. Nothing worse than having a great upgrade happen. People go and use the system and the farm's just running terrible and slow. They're going to have a bad experience and they're not going to want to continue using the platform. Also, have a look at your existing performance. You know, is your SQL Server having issues? Is it bandwidth latency? Are you having any issues in there? And that enables you then, if you are having issues in your existing environment, or maybe it's vastly overspec for the amount of load you're getting, you can adjust your 2013 environment to match. Also, have a look at your existing content. Often there's a lot of old content around that people aren't using. We can bring that across, but you know, it's worth evaluating. Do you actually want to bring a bunch of this content across? And if so, do you want to make changes to it as part of what we would call a migration rather than an upgrade? One of the other big things to take into account is if you're going to change the URL of your SharePoint site. Now, it often makes sense, you know, from a marketing and communication point of view, that because we're going with a new version of something, we might want to give it a new name. And that's fine. It's something that you can do. But in terms of things that break a lot of stuff during upgrades, this is probably one of the things I would list as the highest risk to do it. And it's really, if you can, avoid a URL change as much as possible. What we do in order to do that is when you do a test environment for the upgrade, we'll use host entries or a similar technique to ensure that we can actually bake the production URL while we do that testing to make sure we're testing on the right URLs. And then we use other techniques to make sure those are isolated. And another technique you can use if you do need to change the URL is try not to stack that on with the upgrade. If you can do it before, you can do it as an event after. That gives some time so that you can deal with all the issues that a URL upgrade will cause. And mainly, it's not that the product has issues with changing URLs. Typically, it's customizations and content which has lots of URLs hard-coded into it. So, for example, Word documents. People might often link one Word document to another with an actual hard-coded full URL rather than, you know, a relative URL or something like that can move around. Info path forms, very common to have full URLs hard-coded in them instead of using data sources. Workflows, all those kind of things are very, very common that you'll see it even in pages, hard-coded full URLs that are going to cause and break. It can often be very hard to explain to people that, hey, it's not the SharePoint environment that's actually broken, you've hard-coded old URLs in your content, and that's why you're actually seeing issues. And certainly if you are going to do a URL change, there are definitely some good things you can do to help ease the pain of this. So, you know, whether on a bit of user communication is very important. You can also put in automatic redirect components as well. So if there are some very common URLs you know you've shifted around in the IA, you might want to do some automatic redirects. That will work with, you know, web-based access, but not things like the WebDAV from Microsoft Office. So you probably also want a bit of education on the page not found page to tell people if URL changes have occurred. It's also a really good time to think about governance. Often, you know, people are using a SharePoint platform and it's very different now in terms of what's happening on this platform than when it was first installed and configured. So it's a good time to sit back and think, you know, are there changes we need to make? Also, there's a whole bunch of new stuff coming. Do we need to have anything in place to make sure that people know how to use these new features, whether or not we're going to allow them to use those new features? And, you know, what level of control do we want to roll out to admins? Sometimes when you do an upgrade, because there is a whole bunch of new functionality available there, you might actually want to dial back some of the permissions your users currently have, just so that they don't see a lot of that new functionality until they've had a chance to get ready and up to speed with the new platform. And you do actually have some control as well, so you can actually stop people, whether or not they can create sites in the old mode or whether they can only create sites in the new mode. That's available with a bunch of commands so that you can actually prevent people from creating old sites and just have them create in 15 mode only. Also whether or not you're allowing them to perform the upgrade or you guys are going to do it through commands. It's also really critical you have your notification plan in place. So you need to plan well in advance to let users know when the upgrade is going to happen. And include a lot of info about what will happen and how it will be communicated, especially about any changes, when it's going to go offline, those kind of things. A number of times we've got nearly ready to go live with a migration, and as part of the communication plan, the notifications have come out, and a group in the business has come back and said, oh, I'm about to do X on that same weekend, we really need SharePoint up and available, so, you know, we've had to reschedule things. As long as you have that communication plan to notify everyone in place, then that's very easy to handle. Also really important to tell people when it's finished. As part of that planning, we also have internal communication versus external communication. So what are the internal people within the project team and the stakeholders that are going to be communicated to? When are they going to be communicated to in the upgrade? And what go live, no-go points are we going to have? Often if you're doing it across a weekend, you might set up 3 or 4 conference calls just to everyone jump on the phone, make sure it's tracking okay and decide to continue to proceed, or if there has been a major event, put it on hold and redo on another occasion. I mentioned this a little bit when we talked about the third-party customizations, but when you're thinking about an upgrade, it's an excellent time to think about a bit of spring cleaning in here. If we can get things nice and clean before we do your upgrade is going to be a lot quicker to do. So some of the things that we like to look at are getting rid of sites and webs if you don't need them. If you've got an old site that's been hanging around for 2 years, it's got no new content in it, no one's accessing it, delete it away. You can do the same with versions of documents as well. Sometimes people have enabled that setting to store every version of the document ever created. If you don't have a records management need on there, it's something where you might want to run some commands to go off and delete a bunch of the old versions of those documents. All those activities of deleting the old content will make things a lot smaller for when you do your upgrade, and then it will go faster. Equally, often SharePoint farms over their life cycle have a lot of things which are installed and uninstalled or half installed and uninstalled and might not be in use. So have a look at your templates, features and web parts and clean up any of those things that are installed and not in use or partly installed and in an error state. Equally, if this farm did go through a 2010 upgrade already, if you've got any sites that are sitting in that old visual upgrade mode, so they look like 2007, you'll need to finish the visual upgrade to put them into 2010 mode before you actually start the next upgrade, which of course makes sense. The other thing to check is if you've got any database level issues as well, so you might need to run database repair or force some deletions of sites, those kind of things. But definitely start doing this cleaning now if you can. The cleaner you can get all your content, the smoother your upgrade is going to go as you go across. Alright, so then we get into the test stage. When we actually build a test environment, one of the key considerations to be very careful about is because we're trying to prevent and minimize URL changes, we will often use host entries, as I mentioned, to make the test environment behave like production in terms of the customizations. This means you have to be very careful, though, to not impact live environments from test ones. It'll be a big problem if you do. So some of the things you might want to consider and look at is things like SMTP blocks in place to make sure you're not going to send out emails from the test environment while these things happen. In fact, often we will totally, from a network point of view, isolate the test environment from being able to talk to the production servers at all while we perform this testing. That way, even if it's things like a web service call from an info path form, there's no risk that it can go off and access production because we've got it completely blocked. It can be very problematic if some of those testing artifacts end up accidentally talking to production. When you build your test farm, please use real data and copies of the entire databases if you can. There are some security considerations sometimes, which mean you can only use a very limited amount of test data, but if that's the case, you have to flag it as a big risk after production migration. Very common that you'll find a lot of the sites, will flow through fine, but it's always the pieces you don't test if you've only done a sample that are going to cause issues when you actually do that production migration. The other thing to do is when you're testing, you really need to engage the business users who actually know this content well. Very hard from an IT or technical point of view. You can tell if an error was thrown, but you may not know if it behaves exactly like the business users are expecting it to. So once you've got your test farm and the upgrade happening to it to a degree where you're ready to give end users access to test, very good idea if you can get them in there and get them to do proper testing. They'll often need some guidance though around what proper testing means. What are the functions you need them to perform? Do you need them to just look and see if they've got the same number of documents? Do you want them to actually test those documents, or are they using forms, those kind of things? Also, if you can, try to use similar hardware. One of the things with an upgrade is it's really hard to predict exactly how long, to an accurate degree, an upgrade is going to take. So if you can use similar hardware for your test environment, this means that you can get a very good idea around how long the production upgrade will take. And in fact, if you are using a parallel farm, so you're using new hardware in production and that can be stood up in a manner that's not going to impact your existing production environment, when you do your final test run, good idea to use that actual production hardware. It gives you that opportunity to find out if there are any configuration errors that are going to impact you on the final run. It also means that you've got more set up and ready to go for that final production migration. So the sort of expectations you should be having for what you want to get from your testing is to understand your upgrade methods and processes. So know what works, but also you'll often get a lot of error messages or warning messages during the process. Some of these may be expected based on what the content you've got in your farm. So you need to flag both what the success messages work, but if there are going to be any warning messages you know are going to come through but aren't an issue, make sure you flag them so that people don't get worried when it's the actual production migration. Understand the sort of performance you're going to get. Have a good guess on your downtime as well. Even though we may know it's only going to be a 5-minute downtime and maybe things are going to be read-only for 2-3 hours, I would always recommend doubling that time. It's always better to communicate a longer time period and then to be able to come in under. Much better than, if something does go wrong and having to extend it. And also do those upgrades and make sure it's the same people doing those upgrades as are going to do your production migration. So have a couple of test runs so you know exactly what to expect and you're really confident. Also make sure if you think there might be some issues, you need to make sure you know your escalation points as well. It's always 5 o'clock Friday or middle of the weekend when these issues happen, so make sure you have the key people on hand or contactable that you may need to get a hold of. Often as well, those things can be things outside your environment, so it might be network settings, firewall settings, those kind of things, so you need to make sure they're contactable. But once you've gone through this testing, you've made a list of all the people you need to contact, how long it's going to take, you're actually ready to start moving on this production migration, we move into the implement stage. So this is where we start building our SharePoint farms. Please make sure when you build your SharePoint farms that they're scripted or otherwise done in a repeatable process with a tool or however you're going to do it. If you manually configure all these environments, really big benefit, really big chance they're going to be out of sync in some way. If you use a scripted environment, essentially you don't need to have a 30-page document that tells you how to configure this thing. You've got a bunch of scripts that you can run to reconfigure it should you ever need. So that's also a big benefit in a disaster recovery situation. If you have a services farm or you're just bringing across services onto this existing farm, those are the pieces that come up first. So generally you get all your services running, back up the service databases, make sure the app pools are created and bring those pieces across before you start looking at the content. The process for most services is the same, so really you're restoring a copy of the old version of the source database. Then you create the service application with the relevant commandlets. They're all documented on TechNet. And then you create the service application proxy and start the service application instance. There are some special commands for project search and secure store, but they are all listed in the relevant TechNet articles that you can access on these. Once you've got all your services up and running and your environments installed, the next things you want to do before TB attach are all the things which I call the foundation pieces. So think about setting up your web applications, but also the configuration, manage paths, AAMs, customizations. You need to get all these things onto your environment before you actually attach the content. That includes your third-party products as well, typically, although you need to consult the documentation for those third-party products to be sure of the timing of the process. Heaps of PowerShell commands are going to help you with the upgrade. What you'll find is you can perform an upgrade and then you can pretty much go in and you can manually kick off upgrades of any site, farm level, content database level if there are any issues. So have a look through all your content database commands and make sure you're aware of which ones to do and which ones to run when. And then you're going to have to go through and upgrade a lot of your customizations if they've been created for you. So there are a lot of changes, as I mentioned, things like there are 2 different directories now on disk for 14 and 15 level changes. So the people that wrote these customizations will need to go through and update their code for when you're running in that new 15 mode. An example of how they might do that is here's a piece of code where if it's running in the new 15 mode, we're going to call out to some specific jQuery resources to load on in. That might be different to what we were using in the other mode. You can also put specific code into your upgrade actions to make these happen. This can be quite expensive to run though as part of the upgrade. So ideally, if you can separate changes to any of your features from the actual upgrade that you're going to do and do them before or schedule them for a time afterwards. Otherwise your upgrade process will run for a lot longer. Also, for new customizations, people need to be aware that there are a lot of changes in terms of how things are deployed. So because you've got the 14 and the 15 directories now, you need to be aware of when you're installing new customizations exactly where they're going to go. So if you are putting new changes onto the environment or you are installing new third-party tools, you just need to review the documentation to make sure you're putting it in the right place in the file system and running the right commands. This is particularly important if you're using resource files, whether they be for language or other artifacts, to make sure that you've got the right resources installed for both modes. The last thing we do before we're ready to start going live is making sure that you go through validate. When you do an upgrade, really common that you'll see, hey, everything's upgraded, I can see it in my browser and get very excited. Really important to actually review the log files though. Looking both for errors but also for warnings. Often the errors won't be big enough to stop content from showing in the browser, but it will be things that manifest over time, and some of that can even be warning situations. So you need to make sure you read through that log file and be aware of any errors or warnings. And if this is your test migration you're talking about, make sure you know a way to address them. Typically start at the top of the log, work downwards. Any time that you see a big error, what it will actually do is it might stop the site from upgrading. So it'll move on to the next site and continue that upgrade process. But you'll then have to, once you resolve the issue at hand, go in and rerun an upgrade for that individual site to make sure it does get pushed properly through the upgrade process. And then you can look at all the, there is specific upgrade error logs that all this will be in. If the right level of detail isn't in the error log, which throws all the errors out, you can look at the full upgrade log, and then finally the ULS logs for more information. You can all have a look at the timestamps for linking that all together. Typically the bigger things are worth solving first because they will actually have stopped upgrades from happening. Things like if you've got an authentication issue or major blocking customization, so if they can't find a data sort of customization that's required, it might again stop the upgrade for that whole site. So you need to solve those, rerun the upgrade for that piece, whether it's a content database or site, and then see if any more issues are being reported. Content issues are the last thing to then look at. So generally it's pretty easy, the sort of steps that you follow are pretty well known. Determine the cause of failure. There's really good logging features at all different levels to work out what's going on. Once you've determined the cause of failure, fix it, confirm the fix, and document the fix. As we're talking about running a couple of test migrations here, you should have all these issues really worked out so that when you run your production migration, it's a really smooth process. What you might even do is when you do that first test migration, you'll come across issues, and as a result, you'll make changes in your production environment to remove the customization that's causing issues or the content that's causing issues, so you won't see it again. And you need to validate predetermined sites, and this means you need to know what are the important sites, so pick them in advance. You forget the CEO's site, and that's what's going to happen on Monday morning. They're not going to say, hey, you've got all the content upgraded, but all my important stuff's missing. You need to make sure that those critical sites, anything that's going to stop the business from functioning or anything that's highly visible to management, public users, those kind of things, make sure they have enough testing to ensure that not only in the test runs, but in that final production run, everything's gone through and it's gone live properly. But don't forget to test new things as well. So not only did all my content get across, can I perform all the new activities that I need to? Can I create new sites, activate features, create new pages, all those kind of things? If you're using templates, can I use them to create new sites? Make sure all those new activities work after the upgrade so that people are not only using the old content, but they can go through and create new things from day one. Other things to test, all the associated features. So not just are my documents there, but can I search for them? Do my user profile features work, or is it the right managed metadata? Any of the features that you're using, you really want to go through and write a quick testing matrix, just so all those pieces are tested, both in the test migration and the production one. Particularly things with My Site, so you won't get some of the new features until the My Site host goes across to 15 mode, so often people might push that piece across. Once it's enabled, then you'll start being able to create new personal sites and a lot of new things will be visible. So this is the sort of thing that you really have to communicate with users. If you're going to leave it in the old mode, well, some of the new things you might know about SharePoint 2013 won't be there yet. If you are going to push it across, there's going to be obvious visual changes to end users. They need to make sure it occurs. And similarly, a lot of this stuff occurs, a lot of the upgrades of personal sites will happen as a timed thing behind the scenes. So you need to allow for that in your upgrade. Other areas, also security. We talked a little bit about that with the claims-based migration that's going to happen. You need to make sure that things are secure, both people can get to it, and if something is secured off, they can't get to it. Any of your external data, and also testing all your customization. So go through, make sure everything's in order, and then you should have a really successful migration. What you'll find is if you do know there are known issues, as long as you catch them before the large number of business users get to see them and communicate them out, that's often a better experience for people going through the migration than if end users find it and have to report them back themselves. So key things we've covered, going through the cycle and to making sure you've got at least 2 test migrations in a test environment before you go to production. Learn about the upgrade methods you're going to use if you're going to do it yourself. Document your environment, get all those customizations written down and make sure you know a strategy for how you're going to get them across. If you do have customizations that need remediation, think about, can I remove those customizations and replace them with out-of-the-box things, or do I need to perform some coding to upgrade them? And then go through that test process. If you can test it on the production farm in a parallel manner before you do that production migration, that will then help you solve a lot of the issues ahead of time. And finally, make sure you have that testing matrix in place. So know how you're going to test the critical sites, how you're going to test all the new activities people want to perform, and also making sure you test all the new services and the things that are going to be in use. So I think we've got a few minutes left for questions. A few other things that you might want to have a look at. If you want to start getting your business users excited about some of the new features, there is another webinar that's been recorded on what are some of the new features. And we've also got an offering around a readiness assessment. So if you want someone to come in and work out if you're ready to do an upgrade and start some of that audit activity, there's an expression of interest form there for that as well. Generally, most of the API level customizations will work. That's a bit of a sweeping statement, but generally you can pick up the WSP and just install it, and that will work. As you have to worry about. Also, if it is some of the areas that have had significant functional changes, so a lot of the search engine has changed. If it's hitting some of those pieces, you may have to make a few changes to the APIs. But in general, they've been pretty good with making everything backwards compatible with having a lot of those 14 files there. So what we've seen so far is not a large amount of change needed to get those customizations across. All right, any other questions? So another question around elaborating on and taking a copy of the configuration database. So basically what you can do is take a backup of your configuration database, put it onto store it in a SQL server, and there's actually a tool on CodePlex that gives you the code to extract that WSP out. So it's a well-known CodePlex piece that's out there. But if you have any trouble finding it, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send it across to you. But basically what that does is ensures you've got the right version of the WSP that was installed. They will be listed in Central Admin, as you sort of noticed, but you may not have the right copy of the WSP there available to install. So getting them out of the config database, just make sure you've got the final version. Any other questions from anybody? Final, we've got a couple of linked questions there. Have you upgraded any businesses and how did they go? So basically what we've been doing is going through a lot of the testing with a bunch of the businesses. And it's quite interesting because from a technical point of view, what we'll find is the upgrade is relatively smooth. We can push a lot of the technical features through. But the actual length of time to get people live with these environments actually takes quite a period of time, and that's around those user adoption and training pieces that we've talked about. There are great features in 2013, but a lot of it's changed for what end users will see. So we're only now in the new year just getting to the point where a couple of our customers are ready to go live. Again, not really particularly technical issues that are preventing them, but more around that communication, those communication pieces, and wanting to make sure that all that's covered and pushing it across. All right, so it doesn't look like we've got any more people typing questions, so we might close off the questions now and shut down the webinar. As I said, my email address is up on the screen, so feel free to contact me if you do come up with questions, and the webinar recording should be sent around as well.